Call the roll.
Senate roll call, day 21, Tuesday, February 11th, 2025. Anderson?
Here.
Barlow?
Present.
Boner?
Here.
Brennan?
Here.
Case?
Play ball.
Cooper?
Here.
Crago?
Here.
Crum?
Here.
Dockstetter? Driscoll?
Home run.
French?
Here.
Guru?
Here.
Hicks?
Here.
Hutchings? Ide?
Here.
Jones? Kolb?
Present.
Landon?
Here.
Larson? McEwen?
Here.
Nethercott? Olson? Pappas? Excused, Mr.
Excused,
President?
yes.
Pearson? Rothfuss?
Here.
Salazar?
Here.
Schuler? Scott?
Here.
Smith?
Here.
Steinmetz? President Beitman?
Here.
Mr. President, 30 present, 1 excused.
Thank you, Ellen. Prayer today by Reverend Christian Basil from St. Mark's Episcopal Church.
Let us pray. Gracious and life-giving God, whose Spirit binds us together in peace and unity, we pray that you will pour out your grace upon this assembly and instill within us a spirit of collaboration and respect, that we may listen with open hearts and minds to serve the people of this state to the best of our abilities. Grant us the discipline of patience, so that our work may be a reflection of the trust placed in us and an example to those we serve. Shape us, O Lord, into something better than we are, refining our intentions, deepening our compassion, and calling us always towards justice, mercy, and truth, so that we may move forward with a unified purpose. For how good and pleasant it is when people dwell together in unity. May that unity not be fleeting, but rooted in humility, love, and a shared commitment that increases with each day that you grant us. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Senator Scott, will you lead us in the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Play ball! Yeah.
Reading, correction, and approval of journal. Will the reading clerk please read the journal committee report?
Mr. President, your journal committee reports that the journal of February 10, 2025 has been read and recommends that it be approved. Senator Crum, Chairman.
Are there any objections? Being none, the report is adopted. Thank you, Chairman Crum. There's no doctor of the day. Today in Wyoming history, here's a good one for you. 1888, Sheridan County was formed from parts of Johnson and Bighorn counties. The county is named after Civil War General Philip Sheridan. Good old Sheridan County, home sweet home. Quote for the day: "It is often the small steps, not the giant leaps, that bring about the most lasting change." Queen Elizabeth II. Today's dad joke of the day. This one's for you, Reverend. How does a taco say grace? Let us pray. I chuckled when you said that because I knew that was going to be the joke of the day. Okay, announcements. Today is the last day for second reading in the House of Origin. Tomorrow is the last day for third. There's your announcements. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special guest here to join us. The Teacher of the Year is here. We have Wyoming's 2025 Teacher of the Year, Morgan Hahn from Lander Valley High School. Ms. Hahn is a social studies teacher. In 2021, Ms. Hahn was honored as Wyoming's James Madison Fellow, a testament to her unwavering commitment to civics education. She is a trailblazer in integrating technology within her district to enhance teaching, support students, and bridge educational gaps. Ms. Hahn's dedication to supporting her colleagues and reigniting their passion for teaching through innovative technologies is truly commendable. Fellow senators, please help in recognizing and celebrating the exceptional contributions of Morgan Hahn.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Wyoming Senate. Good morning, and thank you for having me here today. As they mentioned, my name is Morgan Hahn, and I'm the 2025 Wyoming Teacher of the Year. I'd love to introduce myself a little bit. I have a social studies degree of education from the University of Wyoming and also a master's degree of American history and government with a specialty in teaching the Constitution. I currently teach world history, U.S. history, advanced placement psychology, and advanced placement U.S. history at Lander Valley High School. This title is such an honor to me. I grew up in Douglas and got to teach in Lander, and like many of you, I'm a product of the Wyoming education system. I spent a few years in college chasing a dream of athletics, and then came home to finish my degree at UW and answer my calling to education. My experience in college was really fun and gave me some insight into other states' education systems. And it was enough to know that I really wanted to stay in Wyoming. At the time, teaching jobs were few and applicants were many, and I'm really grateful that I pulled it off because it's allowed me to become part of a story of excellence that is Wyoming public education. We have countless students serving honorably in the military who entered the workforce with the skills they need to be successful. And I've been really blessed to teach kids who are now gracing the campuses of our country from CWC to Princeton. Indeed, we are successfully preparing every student every day to be successful after graduation. Another experience that gave me some really helpful insight was through my fellowship with the James Madison Foundation. This fellowship is a master's degree that comprises of a little bit of time spent in Washington, D.C., and it's awarded to one social studies teacher per state per year. So again, I found myself representing Wyoming, and I got to go live in D.C. with 49 other fellows. It was challenging, and it was really enlightening. And I'm sure you guys can relate to leaving our state and being met with surprise that you don't, in fact, ride a horse everywhere you go. But once we got the stereotypes out of the way, I was part of many conversations that reinforced the amazing work being done here in Wyoming. The amount of times I was able to suggest things to much more experienced teachers was staggering, and not because I'm anything special, but rather because I'm part of a system that's special, and we have the numbers to prove it. I'd love to consider some statistics. Wyoming surpassed or tied national performance in every single category on the National Assessment of Education since 2017. And I say surpassed or tied, we tied them like a handful of times. Mostly we surpassed. Or if we look when they're older, we can check the ACT. This is my favorite one. Wyoming is one of 8 states that tests every single kid. And this year, we led the pack in first place. I gotta brag a little, my school, LVHS, beat even our high state average by 1.4 points. My point is this: Wyoming public education is an effective and innovative system that is robustly and successfully preparing kids for the future. It's comprised of passionate, expert educators who put students first and strike a balance between innovating new practices and knowing what works and implementing them accordingly. We hold fast to a Wyoming work ethic and do what needs to be done for kids from kindergarten to graduation, for them to be successful. And of course, there's always room to grow. Until we have 100% of kids across the finish line, we have to keep chasing improvement. But here's the amazing thing for all of us in Wyoming. We see the faces these statistics represent. When there's a gap, we know their names. And when we see these mountains of evidence for success, we're not surprised. We see their faces. Everyone in this room can think of kids that embody this story. Maybe it's kids, grandkids, or kids you recognize from the paper, or ball games you attend, because that's what we do in Wyoming. We care. I see high test scores and I think of Ella, who's an honor student at UW, crushing it, and is also a really good big sister. I see Braden, who worked a career in landscaping to save for medical school, where he's now thriving. I think of Avery, who just finished boot camp and is now protecting our country in the Navy. To me, this is one of Wyoming education's greatest payoffs, and certainly the most noble reason for us to work together for their success. Our state, as you know, is one big small town, and when we work together, when we collaborate, there's nothing we can't accomplish. We, as educators, legislators, parents, and citizens, can work together and send an important message to kids, that education is valuable and they're in the best place to receive one. This looks different in each role, but our goal is the same. So on behalf of teachers across our state, I encourage you to reach out to your local educators and grab a coffee. We'd love to talk to you. In fact, there's a cohort of excellent educators today here through Level Up who'd be more than happy to chat. Whatever it looks like, I encourage you to make these connections with the folks who are in classrooms and schools, working with kids every day. Wyoming is in a uniquely successful place when it comes to education. The national narrative doesn't reflect this, but the numbers do. The story of our students' consistent track record of success after graduation does as well. And personally, I'll take real data and the real success of students over headlines any day. Wyoming is leading the nation in education, and I'm really optimistic about the future of us collaborating and ultimately rallying around our kids so that this generation is able to achieve even greater heights than the ones that came before. So thank you again, Wyoming Senate, very much for allowing me the privilege of the floor this morning. It's an honor to be here today. It's an honor to teach our kids, and it's an honor to represent Wyoming in the profession I've been called to all my life. Thank you.
Well, Morgan, on behalf of the Wyoming Senate, we are honored to have you here today, and we are so thankful for your efforts and your success. We wish you continued success in the future, and to all the teachers out there, we support you 100%, and we have your back, so thank you. Messages from the House.
From the House of Representatives. These messages are dated February 10, 2025. Mr. President, the following bills were indefinitely postponed after failing Committee of the Whole. House Bill number 304, State Lands, Hunting and Fishing on Cultivated Cropland. Ayes 10, noes 50, excused 2. Message number 222, House Bill number 341, Summer Nutrition Assistance for Children. Ayes 25, noes 34, excused 3. These bills have been indefinitely postponed. Sincerely, Katie Talbot, House Chief Clerk.
Thank you, Randy. House bills on first reading.
Oops.
House Bill 43, first reading of the House bill.
House Bill 43 engrossed, age verification for websites with harmful material. Sponsored by Representative Lawley, an act relating to child protection. Passed the House, ayes 59, noes 1, excused 2.
House Bill 43 is assigned to Committee Number 1, Judiciary. House Bill 72, first reading of the House bill.
House Bill 72 engrossed, Protecting Women's Privacy in Public Spaces Act, sponsored by Representative Lawley. Passed the House, ayes 52, noes 8, excused 2.
House Bill 1 is assigned to Committee Number 1, House Bill 72 is assigned to Committee Number 1, Judiciary. Excuse me, there's some distractions going on. House Bill 36, first reading of the House bill.
House Bill 36 engrossed, Hathaway Scholarships Amendments, sponsored by Representative Harshman. Passed the House, ayes 61, excused 1.
House Bill 36 is assigned to Committee Number 4, Education. House Bill 4, first reading of the House bill.
House Bill 4 engrossed, Snowmobile Registration and User Fees, sponsored by the Travel Committee. Passed the House, ayes 54, noes 7, excused 1.
House Bill 4 is assigned to Committee Number 6, Travel. House Bill 5, first reading of the House bill.
House Bill 5 engrossed, Fishing Outfitters and Guides, Registration of Fishing Boats, sponsored by the Travel Committee. Passed the House, ayes 35, noes 22, excused 5.
House Bill 5 is assigned to Committee Number 6, Travel. House Bill 73, first reading of the House bill.
House Bill 73, Recreation Safety, Rock Climbing, sponsored by Representative Larson. Passed the House, ayes 60, excused 2.
House Bill 73 is assigned to Committee Number 6, Travel. House Bill 173, first reading of the House Bill.
House Bill 173 engrossed, independent candidate requirements, sponsored by Representative Harrelson, passed the House, ayes 49, noes 11, excused 2.
House Bill 173 is assigned to Committee Number 7, Corporations. House Bill 181, first reading of the House Bill.
House Bill 181 engrossed, funeral contracts, investment and bonding requirements, sponsored by Representative Larson, passed the House, ayes 61, excused 1.
House Bill 181 is assigned to Committee Number 9, Minerals. House Bill 135, first reading of the House Bill.
House Bill 135, autologous or direct blood donations, sponsored by Representative Guggenmoos, passed the House, ayes 57, noes 3, excused 2.
House Bill 135 is assigned to Committee Number 10, Labor. Reports from standing committees.
Mr. President, the following reports are dated February 11, 2025. Committee Number 5, Agriculture, State and Public Lands and Water Resources, to whom is referred House Joint Resolution 2 engrossed, Foreign Adversaries, Prohibited Property Ownership, respectfully reports same back to the Senate with the recommendation that it do pass. Ayes Senators French, Ide, McEwen, and Pearson. Excused Senator Craigle. Senator French, Chairman. Committee Number 5, Agriculture, State and Public Lands and Water Resources, to whom is referred House Bill 93, Protect Wyoming's Lands Act, respectfully reports same back to the Senate with the recommendation that it do pass. Ayes Senators French, Ide, McEwen, and Pearson. Excused Senator Craigle. Senator French, Chairman. Committee Number 5, Agriculture, State and Public Lands and Water Resources, to whom is referred House Bill 61 engrossed, State Land Lease Preference Amendments, respectfully reports same back to the Senate with the recommendation that it do pass. Ayes Senators French, Ide, McEwen, and Pearson. Excused Senator Craigle. Senator French, Chairman. Message Number 8, Transportation, Highways, and Military Affairs, to whom is referred House Bill 33, Vehicle Sales and Use Tax Distribution Highway Fund. Respectfully reports same back to the Senate with a recommendation that it do pass. Ayes Senators Anderson, Brennan, and Cooper. No, Senator Cole. Excused Senator Pappas. Senator Cooper, Acting Chairman. Committee Number 8, Transportation, Highways, and Military Affairs, to whom is referred House Bill 27 engrossed, Disabled Parking Windshield Placards Revisions. Respectfully reports same back to the Senate with a recommendation that it do pass. Ayes Senators Anderson, Brennan, Cooper, and Cole. Excused Senator Pappas. Senator Cooper, Acting Chairman. Committee Number 8, Transportation, Highways, and Military Affairs, to whom is referred House Bill 25 engrossed, Vehicle Accident Reporting Amendments. Respectfully reports same back to the Senate with a recommendation that it do pass. Ayes Senators Anderson, Brennan, Cooper, and Cole. Excused Senator Pappas. Senator Cooper, Acting Chairman.
Thank you, Randy. Senator Cooper, do you have a re-referral? Oh, you turn your mic on.
He has an appropriation. I'd like to have it re-referred to Committee Number 2, Appropriations.
Absent objection, House Bill 33 has been re-referred to Committee Number 2. What's the catch title, sir?
Asking me hard questions, sir. Catch title is Vehicle Sales and Use Tax Distribution Highway Fund.
Thank you, sir. So with absent objection, House Bill 33 has been re-referred to Committee Number 2, Appropriations. All right, that takes care of that. Bills on second reading. Oof. Senate File 61, second reading of the Senate file.
Senate File 61, Pollution Control Property Tax Exemption Applicability.
Senate File 61 having been read 2 separate times. The question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. Senate File 125, second reading of the Senate file.
Senate File 125, Defining Healthcare and Protecting the People's Welfare.
There is an amendment. Would the reading clerk please read in the amendment?
Senate File 125, second reading amendment number 1, page 1, line 4, delete.
Senator Simons.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move second reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 125 and ask for your favorable consideration. Fellow senators, this is in response to some of the concerns we heard during Committee of the Whole yesterday. We are inserting on page 2, lines 1 through 7, after therapeutic physical health, inserting mental health. After the moment of conception, insert or fertilization. And in paragraph II, it is created by the amendment after not to be construed as an abortion, insert fertilized eggs that are implanted through in vitro fertilization that are expelled from the uterus after the procedure shall not be considered an abortion. I hope that takes care of that argument. And then on page 2, lines 9 through 16, there's a small change from the association that represents some of our care providers across the state, and that is just where we change the word after intentionally causes harm. It says intentionally terminates the heart, brain, central nervous system, or respiratory system shall be construed as healthcare unless, and then it gives the same language, just kind of redrafted. And then, Mr. President, on page 2 of the amendment, it creates a trigger effect so that we're not interfering with the ongoing lawsuit that is happening now. So whichever is earlier of the two, March 1st, 2026, that's when we would be back in session. And if there's something we need to deal with, we could, or the date which the Wyoming Supreme Court renders the decision on the constitutionality of the Life is a Human Right Act. You see the citations. And so, Mr. President, that is what the amendment does, and I'd ask for your favorable consideration.
Thank you, Senator Steinmetz. Any discussion on the amendment? Senator Nethercott.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good senators, going to page 1, lines 26 through 28. By listing out all of these biological functions, you know, one thing that we aren't doing, which goes, I think, to the senator from Bighorn's question last night, where he listed out medical diagnoses such as encephaly. And that is a diagnosis where the baby doesn't have frontal lobes of a brain, and it is not an uncommon birth defect that occurs in development, where the child has a brainstem but no frontal lobe functioning and no brain development and will not survive. But the child can breathe potentially and has a heart. And so I think we're just really not, I know we want to protect women playing volleyball and sports, but I'm not sure we're doing the right thing here with how we're not protecting women who are faced with very serious medical complications and very serious pregnancies, that they are not able to receive appropriate health care when faced with these catastrophic diagnoses involving their pregnancies that they want. These are wanted pregnancies, and tragedy proceeds, and their inability to receive care associated with this will result in the loss of life to the women we're so concerned about their safety in playing college volleyball.
Further discussion? Senator Scott.
Mr. President, and I've got a couple of practical questions that really don't reach the level that we just heard, but two items. One, the purpose of the amendment, I think, is to clean up some of the problems that were identified yesterday in the Committee of the Whole debate. Am I missing something? One of the criticisms yesterday was that we were defining healthcare across the whole sweep of the, everything in the green books. And I don't see that in the amendment, and would like a little discussion as to whether or not that isn't a problem too, because the risk of unintended consequences, Mr. President. The second is on the back page of the amendment, the last 6 lines, or lines 6 through 11 on page 2. You have an effective date that is relating to a Supreme Court decision. Mr. President, I would like a little further explanation of that one. I don't quite understand what's going on here and why. So, Mr. President, those two questions I have for the proponents of the bill.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Let's go to Senator Rothfuss first.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, for my first time, I have a question on the amendment about the in vitro fertilized eggs, and I know that there's new language being added to try and clarify that, but to me, it actually seems to confuse a little bit more. You have a circumstance where for in vitro fertilization, you have eggs harvested from the mother, they're fertilized in the lab, and then typically they're stored. They can be stored for years, in fact, depending on how many eggs you have, and you're trying to get towards a success. So you're implanting some number of fertilized eggs, trying to get implantation, and then you'll go through this process a few times, and then if you're successful, you may store those IVF eggs for a number of years, and then potentially even use them again later for another child if you're successful. So I'm imagining all of this in the context of having declared that fertilized egg, that IVF egg that's in the freezer is life as deemed by statute. And like affirmatively, that is a person being stored in a freezer that is subject to health care. And I just don't know what that would do from a statutory standpoint. That seems like the biggest thing that this bill would do would be declare that fertilized egg is a person under Wyoming statute, and I assume then entitled to a variety of rights. Those eggs are typically thrown away often at the end of the process, and I don't quite know what that means then under statute when you throw away a life form, which is a person. I don't think we do that. I think that's a crime, probably. So I feel like there's an awful lot that is in this statute, or this particular amendment, a tremendous amount of significant magnitude change to how everything is done in the state of Wyoming just by adding that little bit of language to statute. And I'd like to hear a little more about what thought went into it. I'm afraid of the implications there, Mr. President.
Thank you. Senator Salazar.
Thank you, Mr. President. A quick question on the date of the effective date. The amendment says when the constitutionality of life is a human right act is decided. Maybe you can help me. Is that also part of the prohibition of chemical abortion that was also before the Supreme Court? Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Let's go. Anybody else before the sponsor goes? All right, back to you, Senator Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. President. All right, I'm going to start with the first question about the medical conditions. If you look at the definition of viability, which is on page 3 of your tracked-in version, double Romanet I, abortion, and then if you go down a few lines, except in the case in which viability of the embryo or fetus is threatened. Viability means the stage of human development when the embryo or fetus is able to live by natural or life-supportive systems outside the womb of the mother according to appropriate medical judgment. So in those terminal conditions, that is exempted out. I don't have an answer to this is an overarching policy decision. That is the decision for the body. There is no amendment to address that, so that is what is presented before you for your consideration. As far as the in vitro fertilization, we are exempting that out again. And so storing eggs in a freezer is different than an in vitro procedure where those eggs are fertilized and implanted. If they are expelled out of the uterus, those are exempted out of this bill. I hope that clears up any confusion. As far as the effective date, there's two, whichever comes first, whether we, March 1st of 2026, and we get back into session and want to take further action, Mr. President, or the date in which the Wyoming Supreme Court renders a decision. We're trying not to affect this and restart the clock so that we're tied up in court for longer. The other bill or statute, the good senator in the back, the chairman of appropriation referenced, is tied up in that decision to my understanding as well. So we're just trying to clarify that and not affect that adversely by this legislation. Mr. President, I hope that answers all the questions, and I would call for the question.
Okay. We're voting on second reading amendment number 1, the Senate File 125. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. We'll do a standing division. All those in favor, please stand. Okay. You guys are quiet this morning. Okay, 26. All those opposed, less than 26. All right. Second reading amendment number 1 is Senate File 125 has been adopted. We are back on the bill. Discussion on the bill. Senator Nethercott.
Thank you, Mr. President. So in response to the senator's explanation as to the concern about the severe congenital defects that apply, I think that's a misinterpretation of what the bill actually does. So the reference was on page 3, lines, that second paragraph, right above in the tracked-in version, I think line 9 is what this is supposed to be. This just simply says that if the baby's life is in danger, you can take steps to expel the fetus in order to save the baby's life. It has nothing to do with severe defects that can risk the mother's life by having to go full term. So I don't think that that is even closely accurate to how this works in real life. Secondly, even with that, and this child is dying, what is the obligation then to, under our statute for born alive means of care, then to place that dying baby on life support, which is then referenced on page 3, line 14 of terminating life support services for the mother and its application to abortion. All of these very complicated medical procedures we're putting in here in this tracked-in version of this bill. So just curious as to how the born alive means of care applies in these cases of real tragedy to these families who are wanting a healthy baby, but that just isn't what has happened. And so I just want to make sure, again, we're not harming Wyoming families in our effort to achieve this result.
Any other discussion? Let's go to Senator Guru. You were up first.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I want to thank the bringer of the bill for the amendment. And I know that she's tried to do her best to listen to some of the concerns from just 12 hours ago, 14 hours ago, and work long into the night to try to incorporate this. And we appreciate it very much. As I read it, it does too bring more questions, answer some, brings up more. And that's at the heart of my problem with the whole with the whole piece of legislation. Oftentimes, we do this, and as a matter of fact, I think I've got a bill coming up later, or some of us have a bill coming up later where we've got some amendments, and we're already trying to think of third reading amendments, but they don't have to do with anything to do with life and death. It's about investing money. That's why this is so critical. This is life and death. This is about medical care and what we're doing to our medical community, what we're doing to our doctors, what we're doing to the patients. I happened to go to the doctor today, and we spent more time talking about this bill than we did about my arm. But it's a workers' comp case, so the state's paying for it, I guess. But we did have an interesting discussion, and I actually pulled up the bill and showed it to him, and showed him the amendment because it had just come up. And he just says, oh my God, I don't understand. From a doctor, and that made me even a little more concerned. So as we're moving forward, I hope we think about all that. Like I say, appreciate the event, appreciate the bringer bringing in this amendment today. Still against the bill, but we'll keep moving forward. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Guru. Senator Scott.
Mr. President, and as the Senate well knows, I'm not a supporter of this bill and this issue because, frankly, my church believes something different. But I know I don't see any point in making a big fuss about that, Mr. President, because I know where the votes are on that particular issue. I will vote be a no on the bill. But just in context, what purpose I rise for at this time is to ask the sponsor to really take a very hard look at that provision that takes these definitions and uses them across the full sweep of what's in the statutes. Because I think the risks of consequences that we do not, none of us intend, is high when you do that. And that could be remedied if you just decided that it was proper to limit that definition to just the particular sections that this bill is creating and just the purpose for which the bill is intended. So I really am concerned that the way it's written, Mr. Chairman, there will be unintended consequences that none of us can foresee because this thing hasn't had the full study that some of the other issues have. The bill originally was introduced had a major problem in it. So, Mr. President, I do rise to ask the sponsor to take a hard look at that particular issue and consider a third reading amendment.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just wanted to reiterate the concern that I had now with the bill. For in vitro fertilization, it is not just eggs that are frozen. It is fertilized embryos that are frozen and perhaps for years. They're cryo preserved so that you can continue efficacy and implantation for a number of years. That is the process. That is how it's done. The idea that we have just defined those fertilized embryos as now a human life is disconcerting if this legislation passes. And I don't think we can just gloss over that. I hope everybody understands the implications of putting somebody in a freezer for several years and then throwing them away at the end of the process if they're no longer needed. That is significant. And this is exactly the type of thing that we've seen in other states cause significant problems for IVF when you have a treatment of these fertilized eggs as anything other than what they are. And so this is more meaningful, I think, than was presented. And I hope the chamber will spend a lot of time thinking about what the implications of that are, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Rothfuss. Further discussion on the bill? Senator Smith.
Mr. President, I'd like to commend the good bringer of this bill. Life is so important, and we can get into the nuances of this, but bottom line is, do you believe that a person is a person no matter how small? Justice Horton, and Horton here's who said, Dr. Jesus, like I do, I think the majority of the state feels that way. And yeah, it's a shift, but that's where we're headed, and we're going to protect life, and I'm honored for this.
Senator Nethercott for your second time.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, for those of us that have voted for life for years and years and years, we certainly understand it. And the nuances of this bill are critical to the life and death of the women of this state and those families. So do not gloss over nuances when you are defining health care for all of the men and women and children of this state. This is a fundamental policy decision that's not a nuance. This will affect every human in this state, the born and the unborn.
Senator Grew for your second time.
Yeah, Mr. President, I got to push back a little on that too. It doesn't cut quite as fine as the good senator just made it out to be. Remember, in the last 12 hours, the great medical minds of the 68th legislature, all banding together to decide what medical care is, forgot until this morning to add mental health. Big scope of work in the world of medicine that just got added in here on second reading. You know, good for us. You know, good to know that our medical degrees are functioning at their utmost capacity today. So what will we find on third reading? I don't know. What new medical revelations will we discover there? Will we answer the question about in vitro fertilization? Will we be able to make sure that we covered every single thing that medical science deals with every day in the vast disciplines thereof? I'm sure we can. Should we? Should we? Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Grew. Anybody else before the sponsor? I guess, oh, you haven't gone twice yet. So Senator Steinmetz, for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just to allay some of the fears out there, this language that we inserted as far as definitions came directly from the Life is a Human Right Act, Mr. President. So it's not something we've never seen before. It's not some big, scary, elusive thing we've never considered before. We're just putting them in a different section of statute. So, you know, we've heard this argument before. We've heard these arguments before because we've done this before. And I think we just have a basic, fundamental, different philosophy on this issue. So I'd ask for you to move this bill forward, and thank you for the good discussion, Mr. President.
Thank you. All right. Seeing nobody else rising to speak. Senate File 125, having been read two separate times, the question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. Senate File 133, second reading of the Senate file.
Senate File 133, Protection of Parental Rights Amendments.
Senator Brennan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Without objection, I would ask that Senate File 133 be laid back one day.
Absent objection. What's the point of order, Senator Rothfuss?
Want to make sure it's okay. Got a thumbs up, never mind.
She's falling on her sword. Did I make the motion? Absent objection, Senate File 133 has been laid back for one day. Senate File 156, second reading of the Senate file. Senator Cooper, what's your point of order?
Question, isn't today the last day for a second reading? So can we lay that bill back? We still can?
Yeah, it kills the bill, but if you want to do it, you can do it. Yep.
Senate File 156, Expenditure of State Funds on K-12 Public Schools.
Senate File 156, having been read two separate times, the question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. Senate File 166, second reading of the Senate file.
Senate File 166, Political Party Formation Amendments.
Senate File 166, having been read two separate times, the question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. Senate File 174, second reading of the Senate file.
Senate File 174, Constitutional Apportionment 2.
Senate File 174 having been read two separate times. The question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. Senate File 178, second reading of the Senate file.
Senate File 178, Fixing Reading Failure.
There is an amendment. Would the reading clerk please read in the amendment?
Senate File 174, Second Reading Amendment Number 1, page 18 after line 7, in.
Senator Schuler.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would move second reading amendment to Senate File 178 and ask for your favorable consideration. Again, I mentioned this the other day that I probably have an amendment or two coming. This was actually just a section that I struggled with even when we started to work with the State Department of Education. Really what it does, it takes out the, it requires, right now, the way it is, the bill requires a teacher to have above and beyond what they've already been evaluated on, another evaluation, a licensure that includes a passing score at a professional teaching standards board approved literacy interventionist reading knowledge and skills assessment, which again, I'm sure a lot of our small schools are just going to be tickled pink just to have a highly qualified teacher there without adding all of that. So that's really what it is. If you don't have your second reading, or it's your standing committee amendment, you probably won't be able to track it in, but that's really all it is. We want highly qualified teachers, but again, I don't think a lot of the schools will be able to go the extra route here with adding teacher performance evaluations. They already take a praxis. They already are evaluated all the time. They've got to have obviously a bachelor's degree, and they've got to demonstrate subject knowledge already, and the praxis test is very difficult. So this just added more layers to that, and I just think there's a lot of schools that might not be able to have a reading instructor that would have all those extra performance things available, and we don't want to see this bill die as a result of that. So I think it's a simple fix, and I talked with the bringer of the bill, and I think he's comfortable with it too, so thank you.
Thank you, Senator Schuler. Senator Scott.
Mr. President, yes, this is a friendly amendment. Mr. President, this is in the part of the bill that came to us from the State Department of Education. When we finally got their attention, Mr. President, they got enthusiastic and put in a fair amount of detail that's really off the models they have for how you do this literacy instruction properly. One of the features was asking for some extra training, certification from the teachers, and as a practical matter, bringing that in could well cause trouble in a district. So I think this is a good catch. It looks a lot more extensive than it is, Mr. President. That's just the mechanics of how you have to do it. But it will simplify that little piece, and we may eventually, in due course of time, with plenty of warning, come back and add the piece back in. But at this point, I think it's a good catch, and we're better off without it. So on and for the amendment.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Further discussion on the amendment? Hearing none, we'll call the question. All those in favor of Senator Schuler's motion to adopt second reading amendment number 1, the Senate File 178, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. Amendment has been adopted. We're back on the bill. Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I wanted to make a couple points on this bill. I was in the chair, so I couldn't raise some concerns from up there, but had a few things that I wanted to point out with how the bill is structured. And Mr. President, I think everybody supports the intent of this bill to improve literacy in our third graders. K-3 reading is obviously critical, so we all agree with the importance of this. But just because there's an important issue doesn't mean every bill is the appropriate approach to solve that problem. And there's a few concerns with this bill based on really best practices and what should be done rather than what's being proposed to be done. First thing I'll note is that the legislation delineates between what are deemed to be high-performing districts and those that aren't high-performing districts. But it's a rather arbitrary new standard of performance. I'll encourage the Senate to recall that we have a Wyoming Accountability and Education Act that has been on the books for about 8 years, which looks at a variety of criteria for the success of a district. So it includes performance, which is basically how did you do on your YTOP score or ACT score, but it also includes the concept of growth, how much did your students improve, and then it includes something called equity, which is how much did the bottom quartile of your students improve. That's a particularly important statistic because it's basically how is your school managing its lowest performing students. And those are combined into scores for schools at grade levels and for districts. And so that's the evaluative process for the K-6 system that is relevant here to evaluate whether schools are succeeding or not, because really it's the growth more than the performance that is actually an indicator of whether a school is doing its job, teaching students in a certain year. So the reason I bring that up, Mr. President, is that the idea that we're saying that certain schools are high-performing schools can be more a function of the demographics that they have. In other words, what hand were they dealt? Are these students that are inclined to perform well? I'm from a school district where students are inclined to perform well. They're probably going to do great. And we're probably one of the high-performing districts right now. We've got exceptional teachers, but a lot of it just has to do with you've got a group of students that are going to perform pretty well. And then you have other districts in the state where these districts are challenged. They struggle, and their students are going to perform, on average, on the performance score, lower. Doesn't mean they're poor districts. It doesn't mean they have bad teachers. It just means that it's a different district with different circumstances. Which is why the Accountability and Education Act looks at things entirely differently. And my concern here is we're creating an entirely new criteria, and we're saying, well, here's a group of districts that are doing great, and they don't need any help, when in fact they could be the worst at addressing the needs of the lowest capable students. They could have the lowest equity scores. They could be doing a rubbish job of supporting those students that need it the most. And you wouldn't know the difference based on the assessment that's being used or recommended in this legislation. So it's not evaluating high performers versus low performers correctly. We have a system that does that, and it should be tying into that accountability and education process instead of basically forging a brand new system, which is unnecessary and redundant. That's just growing government. That's creating new government programs. We already have an Accountability and Education Act. We could be tapping into that to evaluate where we need the help and where we don't. And we should probably be looking to the equity score for the bottom quartile of student performers rather than the summative performance score. The second point, Mr. President, I wanted to make is on the idea of retention. A lot of this legislation is based on the idea that we're going to hold kids back if they don't perform at grade level. There is no data or science that says that that helps kids to learn to read or to do better in life. In fact, all of the testimony that we heard was against the idea of retention because it is so socially damaging to the students that they're incapable of achieving their grade level. They're so upset. They're just little ones, and they care an awful lot about their friends. I have a second grader right now. The idea of holding her back in a grade would be crushing to that cute little girl. It would destroy her. And then she'd have to say, well, why? And I'd say, well, because you're a bad reader. So the district held you back. This is not a conversation that second graders, first graders, third graders enjoy, which is why this is not a recommended approach.
5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. You need additional supports, not being held back, Mr. President.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Althus. Further discussion, Senator Scott.
Mr. President.
Oops, sorry.
In response to that, first, we have advice from our consultants that tells us what our assessment test is meaning, and it means the kids that are not performing well enough are not going to be able to participate in the high-tech economy going forward. Mr. President, that's something we have to take quite seriously. We are separating the districts, not high-performing overall, but high-performing in reading, and saying the ones that are doing well don't need the degree of attention that the other districts need. That just makes sense. With regard to the retention, first, the only retention that's contemplated in the very early grades is one that's recommended by the parents. And the expectation, Mr. President, is that it will be an issue of the maturity of the child. And that can be handled perfectly well if the parents think that's a good thing to do. So we aren't talking about otherwise retaining any second graders. But we are talking about retaining fourth graders who are not learning how to read. And I know the progressive, probably saying it's woke is too far, but the progressive point of view on education is you're hurting the child. But think what you're doing if you just socially promote everybody. You are condemning that child to a lifetime of being behind the eight ball because they can't read well enough. Better fix it right up front. The studies I've seen in this area don't really consider the alternative of what are you doing sending a child forward that's not ready. And I've seen it with one of my own children who had to repeat, fortunately a full grade, but a full semester in mathematics in junior high because he hadn't got it. And it was one of the best things that ever happened to him, Mr. President. Use a little common sense on this. We need to put a stop to the common practice in education of just automatically sending forward children that cannot perform, because that does an immense amount of harm to the child.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Further discussion? Back to you, Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by saying poisoning science and data by saying that the assertions that I made in my speech were woke is not an appropriate approach to debate. That's not acceptable. Trying to make it political, that's absurd. We can do better than that on this floor. And I don't appreciate that one bit to the senator. My apologies, Mr. President, for taking that pause, but if you've got data, bring data. If you don't have data, don't insult. Now, as far as the points, getting to the concept of retention, the data suggests that it does not lead to development of those children. What those children need is additional reading intervention. So yes, they need more. That can be done after school programs, that can be done during in-school interventions, and that can be done if we have the funding and resources, which is probably the most appropriate during the summer. So if you think about it from a resource standpoint, holding back a student is effectively one more additional ADM for that student. So you're probably spending around $18,000 for that kid to have an additional year of school, assuming that they complete school, and a lot of those students drop out. Higher dropout rate. Instead of that approach, which there should be a significant fiscal note, you could spend some time during the summer and have intensive reading. Now that's a better recommended practice. That's the type of thing that keeps that child with their cohort so that their social well-being is preserved while they're getting the additional attention. And that's an important aspect. On to the first points about how we evaluate the high reading scores. Again, high reading scores for a school district can be indicative of the demographics of that district. A high equity score on reading through the Accountability in Education Act is going to be specifically targeting the population that are the struggling readers. And that's the type of target you want. So again, we're not evaluating the right thing to determine whether a school needs additional intervention. And Mr. President, I would further note that with the Accountability in Education Act, you have a framework that's already in place that provides supports to schools that need those additional supports. So The system that is being proposed here to support those schools that need additional support is literally already in place, and that was what the Accountability and Education Act does. So this is fully redundant, and I can't stress enough that it's adding new and additional bureaucracy when we actually had perfectly good working old and additional bureaucracy that we put in place years ago, and plenty of it. But Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, the one thing that it didn't have was really sufficient system of supports from the state level through the Department of Education, and they know they need more resources. They've asked for more resources. This legislation doesn't provide that resources any further. So if what we wanted to do was help the districts that need help, providing those additional resources is something we can do through the current model. So again, Mr. President, we're doing this now, maybe not well enough, but creating an entirely new system that then punishes children that don't perform adequately when what they need is additional resources to perform adequately is not the appropriate or scientifically suggested approach. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Rothfuss. Further discussion? Senator Scott, for your second time.
Well, Mr. President, I'm sorry if I offended my distinguished colleague. I thought by saying, look, that calling it woke is going too far. I thought I was trying to avoid getting into that sort of thing. Mr. President, there is a philosophy that has been governing our school systems, and it has not been working. We need to do something because the consultants used our evaluation system, our assessment system, to tell us that we're not doing well. So you got to do something differently. What the bill tries to do is do all the things that were talked about there, trying to solve the problem before we get to the point of needing to do retention. And you want to minimize that retention. You want to get the problem solved earlier. It's better all around. But if you don't have the possibility, you will be sending on children who have not learned adequately, and that's something that we really should try to ignore. So try to avoid. So, Mr. President, we don't need more resources. When you look at the data, yes, there is a demographic that can put a school district at a disadvantage. And the measure we have there is the results from the kids that are on the free and reduced lunch, a poverty measure. And we have found, when we looked at the data, Mr. President, that the better managed districts can do a better job with those children than the statewide average for all the children. That's a problem that if a district under the current resources pays attention to, they can solve, Mr. President. Mr. President, we have a wonderful teacher corps in this state, right across the whole state. But the systems used, the management priorities in a number of the districts are not solving our problems, and we need to do something about it. And that's what this bill seeks to do, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Anybody else wish to speak? Oh, I guess that's it. He was the bringer of the bill, so. Senate File 178, having been read two separate times. The question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. Senate File 181, second reading of the Senate File.
Senate File 181, Eminent Domain Energy Collection Systems 2.
There is an amendment. Would the reading clerk please read in the amendment?
Senate File 181, second reading amendment number 1, page 4, line 8, after.
Senator Crago.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move second reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 181. Ask for your favorable consideration. Good members, yesterday I talked about this amendment when I was explaining the bill, and what this amendment does is just make sure that when the complaint is filed and the company brings the complaint, and according to the proposed law, they would have to submit all of their agreements with all of the other landowners. That those agreements are kept confidential, except they would be provided to the opposing party, and they would not be for general consumption of the general public. And so that's all this amendment does. Happy to answer any questions. Please vote aye.
Thank you, Senator Crago. Discussion on the amendment? Question being called. All those in favor of Senator Crago's motion to adopt second reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 181, please say aye. All those opposed, no. The amendment has been adopted. We're back on the bill. Discussion on the bill. Hearing none. Senate File 181 having been read 2 separate times. The question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. Senate File 187, second reading of the Senate file.
Senate File 187, Public Employee Retirement Plan Contributions.
Senator McEwen, did you wish to speak?
Privilege of the floor, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. President.
Hold on one sec. I got to finish this then. I thought you were speaking on the bill. Senate File 187, having been read 2 separate times. The question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. Senator McEwen.
In the West Gallery, we have a teacher from Thunder Basin High School, Tracy Shadweiler. Can we all give her a warm welcome to the Senate?
Welcome to the Senate. Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. President. And those students with her are Thunder Basin High School students in government and civics class. So they also stood up too, I think, as well. But welcome all of you to the Senate. Thank you, Mr. President.
All right, thank you. Welcome, everybody. Okay. Senate File 189, second reading of the Senate file.
Senate File 189, Uniform Commercial Code Investment Securities Amendments.
Senate File 189, having been read 2 separate times, the question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. Senate File 190, second reading of the Senate file.
Senate File 190, Election Transparency.
There are amendments. Will the reading clerk read in the first amendment?
Senate File 190, second reading amendment number 1, page 11, line 16, delete.
Senator Boner.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move second reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 190 and ask for your favorable consideration. Mr. President, this is simply making an adjustment where we're talking about the early voting period. When you go in person, not the mail-in voting portion of that, but when you go in person to presumably your clerk's office or some other location designated by the clerk. Here's some testimony that maybe 14 days was kind of a little close. This puts it back at 21 days instead of 28, so low middle of the road option seems to have a broad support and is consistent with what the clerk's position has been with how much time they need to really process these early votes and to provide those services in a realistic manner. So that's the amendment. Certainly stand for any questions.
Thank you. Senator Salazar.
Thank you, Mr. President. I guess just my general thoughts on this, it's probably the least, for me at least, the least important part of the bill. What I don't want to see happen is to make this bill more complicated than it needs to be. So just my thoughts, Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Further discussion. Let's go back to Senator Case.
Mr. President, I would rise to support this amendment. I think it's a good compromise. It's thoughtful and works for me.
Okay, thank you. Senator.
Mr. President, I also rise to support this amendment. In committee of the whole, I was concerned because so many of my constituents do work, particularly in the oil patch, and are forced to be absent a good part of the time, would like to be able to go vote in person at the courthouse. Mr. President, this is an improvement. I frankly think going all the way back to 28 days would be a better improvement because some of those people are required to be absent for even longer than the 3 weeks that this provides. But, Mr. President, this does make it better.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Scott. Okay, anybody else? Ready for the question? All right, all those in favor of Senator Boner's motion to adopt second reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 190, please say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The amendment has been adopted. Second reading amendment number 2. Will the reading clerk please read in the amendment?
Senate File 190, second reading amendment number 2, page 1, line 7, after.
Senator Boner.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move second reading amendment number 2 to Senate File 190, ask for the body's favorable consideration. Mr. President, this once again is a result of some feedback from the clerks. Remember, a portion of this bill is allowing for hand recounts if the election is close enough. And so the clerks just want to make sure that there's enough time to deal with that provision. That's already accounted for in the bill, where we extend the canvassing board by 1 week. So the canvassing board already in the bill will be meeting a week later to allow some additional time for that hand count. And the concern was that for the primary, that gets you really close to the general election. Once again, they're worried about a time crunch in between when the canvassing board meets a week later, according to the current bill, and when the general election has to begin. And so this merely moves up the primary election by 1 week to give the clerks a little bit more time, so that basically they have the same amount of time after the canvassing board and before the general election. That doesn't change. If we don't make this change, then they're losing a week, and that's a concern. So that's a change, that's a policy consideration. I ask for your favorable consideration.
Thank you, Senator Boner. Discussion on the amendment? Discussion, Senator Case?
Mr. Chairman, or Mr. President, I may have, I'm not sure that I heard it, but have our friends that run the elections in the counties been aware of this? Does this work for them? It sounds like it does, and I'm inclined to support this, and I just want that to be crystal clear.
Okay, thank you, Senator Case. Let's go to Senator Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So there are a lot of interactions in the election law, and so I wonder about campaign finance reporting and other things that will be impacted by this, because this seems to push I think it's very clear, it pushes it a week earlier. We just had a discussion about early voting, in-person voting, being 2 weeks earlier versus 3 weeks earlier versus the current 28. This will impact other dates as well. So I'd like the bringer of the amendment to give us some indication of how this impacts other dates, filing dates for, like I say, campaign finance, et cetera, that might be influenced by this. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Barlow. Anybody else for the sponsor? All right, back to you, Senator Boner.
Thank you, Mr. President. To be clear, this language came directly from the folks who run our elections, so I'll be sure to verify with the questions that my colleague from Campbell County asked. But to be very clear, I appreciate my colleague from Fremont County asking for that clarification. This is the request of the folks who actually do the work, and so the language is almost verbatim. We made a few changes in terms that they asked for 2 weeks, to be clear, in full transparency. We felt 1 was more appropriate, but this is, and so this is the exact language that they asked for in terms of the construct of the amendment. So I'll double check to make sure there's nothing else, no other moving parts here. But this did come directly from the folks who deal with these statutes on a regular basis. So good questions. I'll be sure to follow up. And if we need a third reading amendment, we'll do a third reading amendment. But for now, I'm trusting the folks who do the work and provide this amendment.
All right. Thank you, Senator Boner. We're voting on second reading amendment number 2 to Senate File 190. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed? Amendment has been adopted. We're back on the bill. Discussion on the bill? Discussion, none. Senate File 190, having been read 2 separate times, the question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. Senate File 195, second reading of the Senate File.
Senate File 195, Small Business Emergency Bridge Loan Program.
Do There is an amendment. Would the reading clerk please read in the amendment?
Senate File 195, second reading amendment number 1, page 5, line 1, delete.
Senator Scott.
Mr. President, move adoption of this amendment. Mr. President, this simply clarifies an issue that was raised in committee of the whole yesterday. Turns out that as written, it reads as if one person had to own a majority of the stock. When you look very carefully at the definitions in Title 8, that is not the way it was intended to be construed, but it sure reads that way. This just clarifies it so that it's quite clear that you can aggregate the holdings of several people to get the majority that have to provide the guarantee and in order to get the loan. So, Mr. Chairman, this does just try to make it a little clearer, and that's the purpose of the amendment. So, on and for the amendment.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Discussion on the amendment? Hearing none. All those in favor of Senator Scott's motion to adopt second reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 195, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed? The amendment has been adopted. Back on the bill. Discussion on the bill? Senate File 195, having been read 2 separate times, the question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. Senate File 197, second reading of the Senate File.
Senate File 197, Wyoming Generational Investment Account 2.
There is an amendment. Would the reading clerk please read in the amendment?
Senate File 197, second reading amendment number 1, page 3, lines 9 through 17, delete.
Senator Hicks.
Mr. President, I move second reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 197 and would ask for your favorable consideration, members of the Senate. Yesterday, we had a very good discussion about the creation of an intergenerational fund. This is something that your Capital Finance Committee has looked at over the last 2 years. There is significant, I think, support for this. Devil's in the details, folks. And so yesterday was the starting gate, and once the starting gate was let out, I recognized as that horse got to the first corner, it didn't have a rider on it. And so what this attempts to do is just put a rider on this horse, put some sideboards on it. So the first provision that it does, it says this will be effective July 1st of 2026. And so the reason that we want to do that is I think we need to get through this biennial budget, come back next year, take a look at, see where we're at with the LSRA financially. Gives us another chance to work on this. We really need to look at this as a potential constitutional amendment, and I think that's something that we can take up in the interim to take a look at. But putting a rider on the horse is what it basically does is because this $100 million transfer would come out of the LSRA. The way the current bill is constructed, if you only have $300 million in the LSRA, $100 million would automatically transfer. I don't think that's good public policy. That's your rainy day account. So what this just does is it sets a graduated transfer. So if the LSRA is more than $1.75 billion that you have in your rainy day account, $100 million would transfer. So it just graduates this down based on the balance in the LSRA. You get down and you have $1.5 billion in the LSRA, only $75 million would transfer. Graduates down, and then one of the operative things in here is when you get down to Romanet 3 on the very bottom. These transfers only occur after all of those other obligations that we put on the LSRA are done. And so this is the balance after. So if you look at your goldenrod, we have an auto appropriation of $100 million that backstops the school foundation program. Until that transfer is done and all of those other legislative obligations and transfer, then it looks at the balance on July 1st, says what's the balance, and then it appropriately then transfer those monies based on the balance of that account on July 1st. Mr. President, I'd stand for any questions. We're just putting a rider on this horse.
Next discussion on the amendment. Let's go back to Senator Driscoll.
Mr. President, thank you. Great amendment. It's a good addition to the bill. Folks, this really is probably transformational for the state. Let's keep it moving forward. We're getting it down to where it's actually where it needs to be at. And I thank the good senator for bringing this. It is a healthy addition. Thank you.
Senator Guru.
Thank you, Mr. President. Sometimes I call it the eye of the hurricane syndrome. When you're in the middle of a bill and you know everything about it, and you're talking about it all the time with all these different people all around, you think everyone else is on the same page you are, and sometimes you get ahead of a page or two. I talked about this bill yesterday, and I do believe it, still do. I believe in this amendment. This amendment's a good amendment. Matter of fact, it's so good, I was talking about it as if it were already there. And so that's the eye of the hurricane part. And so when I said it, I was like, yeah, it does all these things, and maybe the good senator on the other side of the room might want to elaborate on it. And he didn't get up, because we haven't put in the amendment yet, Mike. Oh. So on and for the amendment, that was long overdue. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Guru. Ready for the question? Question being called. All those in favor of Senator Hicks's motion to adopt second reading amendment number 1 to Senate File 197, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. Motion passes. We're back on the bill. Senate File 197, having been read 2 separate times, the question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. Bills on third reading and final passage. Madam Majority Floor Leader, do we have a consent list?
Mr. President, I move third reading consent list as follows. Senate File 22, ground for termination of parental rights guardianship. Senate File 157, Department of Family Services confidentiality amendments 2. Senate File 164, pari-mutuel rodeo definitions. Senate File 169, strategic investments and projects account repeal. Senate File 175, unemployment insurance coverage period and reporting. Senate File 179, sage grouse compensatory mitigation amendments. Senate Joint Resolution 8, political expenditures.
Thank you. Anybody wish to have any bills removed from the consent list? Senator Smith.
Mr. Chairman, without objection, I request that SJ8 be removed from the consent file.
Absent objection, Senate Joint Resolution 8 is removed from the consent list. Any others? Senator Pearson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would request that SF 22, ground for termination of parental rights guardianship, and SF 157, Department of Family Services confidentiality amendments 2 be removed, please.
Hearing no objection, Senate File 22. Did you say 157?
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Thank
and
you.
Senate File 157 have been removed from the consent list. Okay. Having been read 3 separate times, the question is, shall these bills pass the Senate? Senate File 164, pari-mutuel rodeo definitions. Senate File 169, strategic investments and projects account repeal. Senate File 175, unemployment insurance coverage period and reporting. And Senate File 179, sage grouse compensatory mitigation amendments. The chief clerk will call the roll.
On the consent list, Anderson? Aye. Barlow? Aye. Boner? Aye. Brennan? Aye. Case? Aye. Cooper? Aye. Crago? Aye. Crum? Aye. Dockstetter? Aye. Driscoll? Aye. French? Aye. Guru? Aye. Hicks? Aye. Hutchings? Aye. Ide? Aye. Jones? Aye. Kolb? Aye. Landon? Aye. Larson? Aye. McEwen? Aye. Nethercott? Aye. Olson? Aye. Pappas excused. Pearson? Aye. Rothfuss? Aye. Salazar? Aye. Schuler? Aye. Scott? Aye. Smith? Aye. Steinmetz? Aye. President Beitman?
Aye.
Aye. On the consent list, 30 aye, 1 excused. Senate File 164, are there any changes? Aye. Aye to no. Hutchings? Aye to no. Steinmetz? Aye to no. Pearson? Aye to no. French? Aye to no. Scott? No. Larson? No. McEwen? No. Nethercott? No.
Bateman, no.
Whitman? No. Salazar? Salazar, no. Smith? No. Dockstetter? No. Closing vote? Closing. Vote closed. Senate File 164, 17 aye, 13 no, 1 excused. Senate File 169, are there any changes? Rothfuss, aye to no. Closing vote. Closing. Vote closed. Senate File 169, 29 aye, 1 no, 1 excused. Senate File 175, are there any changes? Scott? No. Brennan? No. Rothfuss? No. Case, no. Schuler? No. Smith? No. Closing vote. Closing. Vote closed. Senate File 175, 24 aye, 6 no, 1 excused. Senate File 179, are there any changes? Closing vote. Closing. Vote closed. Senate File 179, 30 aye, 1 excused.
Having received the affirmative vote of the majority of the members elected to the Senate, Senate File 164, parimutuel rodeo definitions, Senate File 169, strategic investments and projects account repeal, Senate File 175, unemployment insurance coverage, period and reporting, and Senate File 179, sage grouse compensatory mitigation amendments have passed the Senate. Bills on third reading. Senate File 22, third reading of the Senate File.
Senate File 22, sponsored by Senator Schuler, ground for termination of parental rights, guardianship, an act relating to children.
Senator Pearson.
Thank you, Mr. President. So, members of the Senate, I am struggling with this bill. I understand the arguments. I just wanted to be clear in the way that this was written. So say a child is with the grandparents or a family member for 24 consecutive months. Does that mean that the parent will be terminated of all rights? I'm not talking visitation. So say this parent straightens out after 5 years and wants custody back of her children. Does that mean that she or he can not get custody back? Is that what this bill is saying? And so that's what I would like to know. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Discussion on the bills. Senator Schuler.
Thank you, Mr. President. Very good question. As I mentioned before, we've got about 11,000 kids in Wyoming that are being raised by grandparents, aunts, and uncles. About half of those have been with them for at least 5 years. The problem that we were seeing in the discussions that we heard with the judiciary and other places where, other people I talked to, was that a parent, let's just say it's a mom, and maybe dad's not in the picture at all, maybe having issues with, mostly it's with addiction. They're in and out of treatment. The child gets taken here, gets taken there, back to grandpa, back to the aunt or uncle, whatever. And this happens for years. The problem is, without any court order to the grandparents, of course the parents can do that. They can do that we had one student who came to testify in our committee that was a junior in high school. He's been with his grandparents since he was 7, but the grandparents did not have custody because we didn't have this bill in place. Grandparents wanted to have custody, but the mother was in and out. They're not even sure maybe where she is. The problem is that we've got these kids that are, like I said, being bounced around like, pinball machines, and it really affects them sometimes their entire life. This young man said if he hadn't had his grandparents and they hadn't been able to support him and he hadn't had to, be in foster care, he probably wouldn't have made it. So it's a good question. Just remember that there are 9 grounds in statute right now which pertain to grounds for termination. But the courts have to have clear and convincing evidence that this parent can no longer parent their child. They have the Wyoming Rules of Civil Procedure apply to those termination hearings, and the court has to find a statutory basis for termination by clear and convincing evidence. So it's not something that's going to happen just willy-nilly. I mean, it's obvious that 2 years or more that this young person has been in the care of an aunt or uncle or grandparents are making progress, and that parent maybe just can't get it together. Maybe they're in jail, maybe they're who knows where, on the streets. So it's just a protection for the children. The parent, if they ever do get themselves together, can come back, they can visit, they can actually, if they wanted to, they could live with the grandparent, with the child. They could, it's not like they can't ever see them or can't ever have any contact. They certainly can. And that's the hope. The reunification is the hope with this bill, is that those kids are able to somehow or other reunify, but at least it protects the kids from being bounced around for years, not knowing really where a stable home life is, when in fact the grandparents or the aunts and uncles are providing that support. So good question. I hope that answers it.
Thank you. Let's go to Senator Case.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm a little troubled by this bill too. The right to raise your child is a fundamental right. It's one of the big ones. And sometimes parents fall short. And thank God for these foster homes and the relatives that step in and the non-relative foster parents step in to help. As these young parents, work their way through life and mess up many, many, many times, have problems with substance abuse. But they're still the parents, Mr. President. I'm worried that this sets a clock and sets up kind of an adversarial situation between grandparents, parents, and grandchildren. Our first goal should be to try to reunify the family, to make it all work, to have happy grandparents, happy children, happy parents. Doesn't work like that. But when the grandparents have a clock on their side and they can do everything they can to defeat the success of the parent achieving, conquering substance abuse, following the court requirements, being clean and sober, it puts them in a place where, they give up on their child and they go for the grandchildren. And maybe that's a really good decision. And that is such a struggle, and I feel for these foster children that are in this system, all the people involved, and the torturous parents that have brought us to this point. But I'm not sure that this is the fix. I'm not sure that this doesn't just maybe encourage grandparents to have a clock on their side that allows them to, if they can keep the relationship between the grandchildren and the parent to be unsuccessful for 24 months, then they drive the bus. I'm not sure that's the right position for the government to be in. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Case, let's go to Senator Nethercott first.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to provide some clarity as to this bill. This has nothing to do with the state or the foster care system. This is a very unique situation that happens to families where typically dad is not in the picture if he's even known. Mom is struggling for whatever reason, and she leaves child with grandparents, and then she goes MIA forever, for years. If mom is actually super responsible, and dad, they get a guardianship. And so that's a super good thing. And we really want to encourage that behavior of parents who are struggling, getting a legal guardianship to a safe relative or whomever, but typically it's grandparents. So I'm fearful that this bill has the opposite effect, because often what happens is those parents who are struggling can't be found to even get the guardianship in place or do not consent to the guardianship. And really, the child really is in limbo land. And everybody's afraid to call for supports because nobody has any legal rights that's in the care of this child to do anything. And everybody just kind of makes it work. The schools, healthcare providers, but the state custody is not triggered here. This is all family law land. Under our state court system, when a child is removed from a home for abuse and neglect, reunification is the law. There's all kinds of constitutional due process protections in place. That's a whole different can of worms. This is trying to solve a problem that currently exists in our state, but I think it will have the exact opposite effect of what it's trying to do, which is to provide a safe place for children in a legally stable environment, because this would discourage parents from entering into a voluntary guardianship, because that clock starts to tick to where their rights would be terminated. So I'm on and against the bill for that reason. I do look forward to the sponsor and others recognizing there may be other legal solutions available that could be creative and innovative that don't involve terminating anyone's rights, but instead perhaps add some rights for those children who are in that state of limbo. So I just wanted to provide some clarity to that piece and how this really may work in the real world.
Senator Cole, you were up next.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a little bit of clarification. It was testified to in committee that if in the case where you had a grandparent who received custody for said child, and the question came up about visiting from the biological parents. To be clear, the people that have custody have absolute control whether they get visited by that situation or in that situation or not. There's nothing that makes someone agree to do that. And obviously, we're talking about family situations which are, severely damaged. And just to be clear, though, they will lose the ability. It's up to the people who have the guardianship as for the child's well-being to make the choice whether they get visited or not. I just wanted to be clear to the body about that, Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cole. Senator Crago?
Thank you, Mr. President. So, little bit about this bill. and what it's actually attempting to do. And it's attempting to remedy a situation where we have people who voluntarily take care of children. May not even be their grandchildren, but could be nieces, nephews, etc. Under the current statute, if a child is placed in the care and custody of the DFS, department that handles our children's care, the state can bring a termination of parental rights at 15 to 22 months, which is less than what this particular provision is talking about. So what happens is these, and let's just stay with the grandparents because we'll keep it simple. Grandparents agree to be guardians. Under the current statute, they're not allowed to ever apply because they agreed to a voluntary guardianship. They can't apply to become the permanent custodians of that child. What we're going to see, and this is my belief, is that we will have grandparents saying, I'm not going to agree to be a guardian. Go ahead and go through the DFS process and have someone, have me appointed as the foster parent of that child, because I actually can apply for this quicker. I can apply for it within 15 months and the state will bring the action rather than 24 months. So this actually provides more protections for the parents, and I think, and that's really what this bill was about. It was trying to remedy this gray area where we have people who are actually trying to do the right thing. They're not making the state go through the whole process of termination of parental rights under the current statute, but more through the voluntary side of it. I think we're actually, I disagree with the good senator from the back of the room. I actually think it's going to have that effect where we force more children into the care of DFS. They end up with the same people, but we're footing more of the cost, and the parents' rights will be terminated quicker, not later. Thank you, Mr. President. On and.
Okay, Senator Nethercott for your second time.
Thank you, Mr. President. So I disagree. Here's why. In order for a child to be taken into state's custody, there has to be, law enforcement needs to be called, or DFS needs to be called, and an allegation that is substantiated that abuse or neglect has occurred. So if that grandparent is complicit in facilitating abuse or neglect, I'm not sure they'll be identified as the appropriate foster parent and game the state system of the state actually taking custody of that child. That's a pretty high-risk game for a grandparent to play because they don't have custody. The state has custody. That child is just placed with a family member. So those rights are very, very different. The state always has custody when abuse or neglect has been proven and reunification is underway. There's another process which is called an involuntary guardianship, when you can't get the consent of the parents or they're gone, as they typically do, where they skip town and are gone for long periods of time. And so grandparents can get emergency guardianships and emergency involuntary guardianships. Those are messy, right? And it requires the grandparents to allege things against their own child that are not ideal. And that can jeopardize that very tenuous relationship. And so they don't want to do that. And that's why that involuntary guardianship isn't pursued. But it is a legal remedy available to grandparents that is commonly pursued. It just makes a very sticky situation. It's much easier when there's trust involved and the parents agree to a voluntary guardianship in place. When there's a court action, anybody, particularly if there's parents involved, those parents can intervene in that court action and they can ask for visitation rights. There's a lot of protections available, and we also have grandparent visitation rights in this state as well. So I really do believe this will have the opposite effect in chilling the willingness of parents to enter into voluntary guardianships of their children.
Thank you, Senator. Anybody else for their second time? Or head over to Senator Schuler.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good discussion. And I think the good senator from the Buffalo area, he actually touched on what I was going to mention, which is one of the 9 grounds for termination is that the child has been in foster care under the responsibility of the state for 15 of the last 22 months. So I guess what we're saying is, well, we'd rather have the grandparents take that child at whatever age they are, pop them into foster care instead of staying with them, so they can get that taken care of, then go ahead and get the guardianship done that way. It doesn't make sense to me. And I think what we really need to focus on here is many of these are grandparents. About over 7,000 of them are grandparents. I don't know about you, I'm a grandparent. I've already told all my kids, I don't want to raise your kids. I love my grandkids, but I don't want to raise them, so please do a good job as parents. I think a lot of these grandparents, I see a lot of them, even when I was still teaching school, that were coming to parent-teacher conferences, who had already decided that, you know, mom's not gonna take care of them, or dad's not, we're gonna take care of them. Some of those folks could barely walk in, you know, in our parent-teacher conferences. You know, they're on one leg and they've got a cane, and how much longer do these kids have to stay in limbo while we're trying to figure out, because we're so worried about that parent that hasn't been around for years, has not been a part of their life, that this is a bad thing for the courts to terminate their rights. That the child really needs to be our focus. They are in a stable relationship. You've got to believe that. It's got to be better than foster care. If they're in foster care, again, we have to deal with all those ACEs, the adverse child experiences that we talked about. Those things that they follow them around their whole life. Being able to be in with their grandparent or their aunt and uncle, or like you said, it could be a niece or nephew, cousin, and we're seeing more and more of that. I'm going to tell you right now, as a teacher, I saw lots of this stuff starting to happen. The kid, the child, whether they're a high school student, middle school, elementary, they should be our focus, really. Where do we want them? We want them in the best place possible. We want them in the safest place possible. I think, you know, rather than leaving them in foster care or leaving them in a grandparent situation who's struggling but wants to do the right thing, this is the right bill, because this is the focus is on the child. Let's do the right thing for the child and vote for this bill. Thank you.
Further discussion on the bill? Hearing none. Senate File 22, having been read 3 separate times, the question is, shall the bill pass? The chief clerk will call the roll.
Third reading roll call, Senate File 22. Anderson? Aye. Aye. Barlow? Aye. Boner? Aye. Brennan? Aye. Aye. Case? No. No. Cooper? Aye. Crago? Aye. Crump? Aye. Dockstetter? Aye. Driscoll? Aye. French? Aye. Guru? No. Hicks? Aye. Hutchings? Aye. Aye. No. No. Jones? Aye. Cole? Aye. Landon? Aye. Larson? Aye. McEwen? No. No. Nethercott? No. Olson? Aye. Pappas excused. Pearson? Aye. Rothfuss? No. Salazar? Aye. Schuler? Aye. Scott? Aye. Smith? Aye. Steinmetz? Aye. President Beitman?
No.
No. Cole? Aye to no. French? Aye to no. Pearson? Aye to no. Salazar? No. Closing vote. Closing. Vote closed. Senate File 22, 19 aye, 11 no, 1 excused.
Having received the affirmative vote of the majority of the members elected to the Senate, Senate File 22 has passed the Senate. Senate File 157, third reading of the Senate File.
Senate File 157, Department of Family Services Confidentiality Amendments 2, sponsored by Senator Olson, an act relating to the Department of Family Services.
Discussion on the bill. Senator Pearson.
Thank you, Mr. President. So as we discussed the other day, I rise in strong opposition to SF 157. The staggering scope of this bill's assault on family privacy isn't just dangerous, it's fiscally irresponsible. Let's be clear about what we're considering. A bill that would dismantle 75% of Wyoming's existing privacy protections without allocating a single penny for the massive security infrastructure such sensitive data requires. And let me be absolutely clear about what dismantling these privacy protections really means for Wyoming. We're not just talking about department efficiency. We're talking about compromising vital protections that touch every aspect of our citizens' lives. This bill would create gaping holes in our domestic violence victim protection systems. It would expose confidential adoption records. It would compromise witness protection protocols. It would even impact teen medical privacy protections and substance abuse treatment records. These aren't hypothetical concerns. Right now, our legal system depends on these privacy walls. Attorney-client privilege, sealed juvenile records, confidential family court proceedings. All of these protections become vulnerable when we start punching holes in our privacy laws. We'd be compromising the very foundations of our justice system and professional confidentiality requirements. We've already seen the consequences of inadequate data protection in Wyoming. In 2022, our Department of Health exposed protected health information of 164,000 Wyoming residents, nearly 1/3 of our population, through a single breach. That happened under existing protections. Now we're being asked to deliberately weaken these safeguards while creating an ever larger target. This bill would require an estimated $6 million in initial investment and $2.5 million annually just to create basic security for a system that would warehouse our family's most intimate details, from child welfare records to juvenile justice data, in one tempting target for cyber criminals. The legislature's failure to include appropriate funding isn't just an oversight, it's a recipe for disaster. Some may suggest that adding an opt-out provision would fix this bill. Let me be clear, it will not. An opt-out provision cannot protect against systematic data breaches. Once information enters a shared system, it becomes vulnerable regardless of individual preferences. Furthermore, many of the most vulnerable individuals whose data would be shared, children in the welfare system, juvenile offenders, adults under protective services, are in no position to be meaningfully opt out of these systems. They rely on these services. Forcing them to choose between essential services and data privacy is just not impractical. It's unconscionable. Every time we share data between agencies, we multiply our vulnerability points. Every transfer, every new access point, every cross-department sharing agreement creates new opportunities for breaches. And for what? The proponents have demonstrated that current evaluation methods are failing or that existing tools are insufficient. Without proper funding, we're not just risking data breaches, we're inviting them. This bill would create an IT security nightmare while potentially violating federal privacy requirements under HIPAA and FERPA. We're being asked to compromise the privacy of our most vulnerable citizens, children, abuse victims, at-risk adults, without any clear showing that this massive data exposure would actually improve services. The other, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this. The other chamber already rejected this approach. They recognized, okay. Let's not make our constituents guinea pigs in a dangerous experiment that, with their personal data. I urge a no vote. Thank you.
Senator Pearson, discussion, Senator Case.
Wow, Mr. President, that must have taken a long time to think and write that up. Mr. President, the heart of the bill is under 922104. And this is where, notwithstanding any confidentiality requirements by law, the director of the Department of Family Services can review the effectiveness and impact of programs and services which shall include sharing data to the extent permitted by federal law. Nothing against federal law, nothing against, to the extent permitted by federal law for the purpose of referrals, provision of services, and participation in bona fide research. The fiscal note, there's no millions of dollars on the fiscal note, Mr. President. We're not violating federal law, and it applies it down again, and it just says that the department may share data in accordance with this, which is under what I just read to you, and farther down, Mr. President, the department for purposes of sharing data for referrals, provision of services, and participation in bona fide research according to this bill. Have you ever gone to like the doctor lately, Mr. President? When privacy restrictions, when you go like to a big medical center, and the privacy restrictions can sometimes be overbearing, and it's kind of tough to get through them. They have a purpose. Of course they have a purpose, Mr. President. But they can sometimes get in the way of providing services. And if, to the extent permitted under federal law, we can have agencies like Department of Health share information with the Department of Family Services or the courts or however this is connected to better serve a child. Man, that would be a great thing. It'd provide for more continuous services. It'd provide for people to all know the issue, to be on the same page. But it's not going to be done with any kind of huge database. It's going to be done in compliance with federal law. And this is not where we need to bring out the tinfoil hats, Mr. President. This is about providing services to children in Wyoming. This is not where we need to read statements that probably came from somewhere off this floor. This is where we just have to think about it and say, would it be better if a caseworker and a school social worker could talk about the case to the extent permitted by federal law? Now, I'm not on this bill. It wasn't in the committee. I only heard a summary of it when I was working with the Advisory Council on Juvenile Justice. And so if I've messed this up, I need one of these fine attorneys in the room to fix it. But we talked about how it would be easier for the Department of Family Services to provide services to people with this bill. It's a people-to-people thing, not hiding behind computers and firewalls, and really getting services to help people.
Discussion on the bill, Senator Ide.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. Yeah, I've got a lot of issues with this bill as well as the person that pulled it from the third reading. I think Department of Family Services, number one, should have their powers limited, not expanded. Maybe should even be eliminated, in my opinion. And it does potentially, infringe on privacy. It's the way I read it, it does. And then again, we're here on the bill, we're undermining our state law to federal law. So I've got a lot of problems with this bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Ide. Discussion on the bill. Senator Olson.
Thank you, Mr. President. So I think there's a lot of boogeymen that we just have to put back in the closet or push back under the bed, because this bill is really it's common sense. If you look at the bill on page 2, line 12, middle of the line, purposes of referrals. And that's why the director is sharing this information. The director isn't sharing confidential adoption records. The director isn't sharing or breaching attorney-client privileged information. The director is reaching out to a service provider to provide information that, I will once again state, can be opted out of to a family or children in need of services to provide only the necessary information in order for that organization to contact the family and provide fundamental services that are much in need for that family and those children. That's all the bill's doing, Mr. Chairman. I ask that you advance this bill. It was, just as a reminder, this bill was studied by a task force. It was studied by an interim committee that vetted all of these concerns as it produced this legislation over months of time. It's a well-vetted piece of legislation. It's necessary for the department to share this information in order to get these referrals rolling in a proper way and get the services necessary. I ask that you advance this bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Olson. Anybody else wish to speak on the bill? Anybody else? Question being called. Senate File 157 having been read 3 separate times. The question is, shall the bill pass? The chief clerk will call the roll.
Third reading roll call, Senate File 157. Anderson. Aye. Barlow. Aye. Boner. Aye. Brennan. Aye. Case. Aye. Cooper. Aye. Crago. Aye. Crum. Aye. Dockstetter. Aye. Driscoll. Aye. French. No. Guru. Aye. Hicks. Aye. Hutching. No. Ide. No. Jones. Aye. Cole. Aye. Landon. Aye. Larson. No. McEwen. No. Nethercott. Aye. Olson. Aye. Pappas excused. Pearson. No. Rothfuss. Aye. Salazar. No. Schuler. Aye. Scott. Aye. Smith. Aye. Steinmetz. No. President Beitman.
Aye.
Aye. Closing vote. Closing. Vote closed. Senate File 157, 22 aye, 8 no, 1 excused.
Senate File 157, having received the affirmative vote of the majority of the members elected to the Senate, Senate File 157 has passed the Senate. Senate Joint Resolution 8, third reading of the joint resolution.
Senate Joint Resolution 8, Political Expenditures, sponsored by Senator Cooper. A joint resolution requesting Congress to propose a constitutional amendment to authorize states and Congress to establish reasonable limits on political contributions made to influence elections.
Senator Smith.
Mr. President, members of the Senate, I'm opposed to this resolution, and I ask that you would consider being opposed to it as well. Friday afternoon, I was singing Kumbaya with all of you. We just passed some serious property tax relief, and we were making some serious efforts to curb unsustainable spending while still getting funds to people who are hurting from disasters, fires, and through amendments in the budget. Then wham, boom, out of the clear blue sky, this resolution comes on first reading. And at first glance, to me, it looked like it was a repeal of the monumental Supreme Court case, Citizens United. Turns out, it's exactly what it is. It's a repeal of Citizens United. Citizens United is not just, it's not a landmark case, it is the landmark case on freedom. And it has protected the free speech of mainly conservative groups and churches on conservative issues like guns, faith issues, like protecting babies in the womb. Citizens United protects pastors and pro-life groups and their members. And when it's communicated by them that our faith demands that we vote for the pro-life candidate. If repealed, groups would be forced by the courts to turn over their donor list or worse, and that's just for them following their faith. If you think I'm exaggerating, from 2008 to 2011, that is exactly what was happening with the patriotic groups that were being attacked. But Citizens United came about and it stopped this in its tracks. Citizens United put a stop to the weaponization of the IRS from 2010 and 11. There were patriotic groups whose donors were being harassed by an IRS agent, not to be mistaken with Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane, but with a similar name. The IRS harassed and targeted donors of patriotic groups merely because their name was on a list of donors that was turned over to the IRS. Is this really the road we want to go down? Trump won in 2016 because he was able to get his message out, in large part because Citizens United allowed him and groups that supported him to get their message out around the mainstream media blockade. They still were outspent 2-1, but at least it gave conservatives a chance. In 2016, the left claimed foreign interference, Russia, Russia, Russia. You remember that? Which turned out to be a false narrative based on no material fact whatsoever. The dossier, supposedly substantiating proof of Russian interference in our elections, was paid for by the candidate on the left who was running for president. We likely wouldn't have known about all this corruption if it wasn't for Citizens United. In 2020, the mainstream media, as well as 51 members of the deep state, fed us a false narrative that the criminal information on a laptop of the son of a presidential candidate was Russian interference. Turns out it wasn't. The mainstream media and deep state suppressed the real story. If it weren't for Citizens United, we probably wouldn't know what happened. Switching gears to the Supreme Court, former head of the ACLU and former U.S. Supreme Court Justice, known for her extreme left and Marxist policies, who recently passed away, called Citizens United the absolute worst ruling in her 3 decades on the court. Why? Because it gave the right a voice, and it gave many of you a voice. With that, there's a handout for you. If Wyoming passes this resolution, it'll join 22 states, as the sponsor said, not necessarily known for their conservatism, including, you take a look right here, including California,
Let's not use
Colorado,
proper
Hawaii,
names.
Illinois,
Hey,
Maine.
proper names are not allowed.
Even states? Okay.
Proper names are not
Okay, sounds good. All right. So you can read it for yourself. You can take this and you can look at I've highlighted it for you. So if you have 6th grade education, you can probably figure that out. All right. With that said, which side of this do you want to be on? Do you want to tell your constituents that you're on? The side of freedom or a side that is limiting political speech? And with that, I'll close with this idea. Voting for this is like voting to give up your guns because you were told utopia would follow. I'm on and against this resolution, and ask you to be the same.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Discussion on the resolution? No. Senator Hutchins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. President, just a quick statement. I was on this bill, and I don't think there was any nefarious intent when the bill was given to me to review. It appeared very benign. But I must say that I do think this body or whoever came up with this 3 readings, it's so important that during the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd reading, we get more and more information about the bills. And with more information, I think I can make a better decision. So thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Hutchins. Senator Ide.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. Just wanted to ask a question, I guess. It looks like this resolution claims that, our constitutional amendment, if this was to pass, would override a Supreme Court decision precedent. And I don't think that it can, but if some of the people smarter lawyers could explain that to me, thank you.
Senator Ide. Senator Nethercott.
Thank you, Mr. President. Bring it down. Bring it way down. Really, really good prepared remarks. So if we look at the first paragraph of the resolution, it requests Congress to consider amending the Constitution to authorize states and Congress to establish reasonable limits on political contributions made to influence elections. This request is there because of the First Amendment and Citizens United. Without those things, the request wouldn't be being made. So you're right. The First Amendment, as interpreted by the United States Supreme Court and Citizens United, has allowed for unlimited private contributions to political action committees to spend unlimited sums of money in campaigns. Some people think that's good. Some people find that concerning. The political ideological argument cuts both ways. There is a Swiss billionaire in this state who has contributed $60 million to progressive liberal agendas, who put on the pro-choice referendum ballot in a state in the Midwest. He's a foreigner with ties to this state, the typical locations as one might imagine, 60 million in just the last couple of years for progressive ideologies, right? Those freedoms cut both ways. There's very rich liberal people, as there is conservative people, and how they try to influence our elections and the people's thinking is of great concern. But to bring it down a whole notch, you're not going to override Citizens United, you're not going to override the First Amendment. You're just asking Congress to look at this issue and understand, is this the right policy for America? And if it's not, what type of constitutional sideboard should be put in place to understand how our campaigns and political speech are funded? It's calling for a conversation. It is calling for a conversation, and that is all the resolution is doing. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Senator Scott.
Mr. President, I've been a supporter on this, and I think the previous speaker really raised an important point. And the need, I'm a supporter of Citizens United. I think it was rightly decided. I think it removed some restrictions that had gotten out of hand. But I also think, Mr. President, with this flood of money that we really don't know in politics, where it's coming from, and who's doing it, and what their motives are, and so we can't really understand what it's all about, has been a real problem. So I think it's possible, Mr. President, that Citizens United, being correctly decided, may have taken things one step too far to a logical extreme, and joint resolutions like this, just asking Congress to look at it, Mr. President, I think serves some useful purposes. So on and for.
Senator Larson.
Thanks, Mr. President. Against this resolution, I think if you're going out there to find, that big donor, you got to open it up and you got to find the little donor. And that's all the small checks you get. This isn't a good way to go. I don't think. It takes away our freedom of speech and freedom of association. We should be able to spend the money we want and associate with the people we want and, gather the money all together. It would go against many of our own associations we work with. The gun association, I didn't name one. There's a bunch of them. Against the resolution.
Thank you. Let's go to Senator Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. President. Those little donors, we declare all those on every one of our election declaration sheets. The three bigger dark money donors in Wyoming in the legislative race in 2024 spent just over $1.1 million. That's probably as much as all the rest of us spent together. In the 2024 elections, nationwide, there was $16 billion spent. It's estimated 2.8 billion of that was dark money. And it's estimated that approximately 1.1 billion of that dark money came from overseas sources. That's what we're trying to get a look at and try to understand who is trying to influence our elections in that kind of magnitude. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Senator Smith for your second time.
Mr. President, this resolution is asking for a constitutional amendment to repeal Citizens United, flat out. That's the language. You can search it for yourself. There isn't a conservative state that has backed this, and you got to ask yourself why. And the answer is because it protects people, it protects freedom of speech, it protects you if you belong to an organization and you give them some money and they're lobbying for a cause, then all of a sudden you're not being audited by the IRS and your name's being put on the internet and you're being harassed. This is just, it's just common sense. We're just better than this. There might be some finance laws down the road that could change, but this is a complete repeal of a great case. And if we go down that road, the next 10 years will, if it were to ever happen, 10 years that follow would be disastrous for conservatives.
Senator Nethercott, for your second time.
Thank you, Mr. President. When I look at those 22 states, it looks like they're all in the West, the Rocky Mountain West. Fascinating. Perhaps someone can break down for me the logic of why we have to report our $50 individual contributions that we receive from individuals in the state, and that gets published online. $20, $100. Those individual financial contributions that we have to list and report, and then gets disseminated to the entire world for who gives us those individual contributions. What is the policy purpose for that? Let's break through the logic there and understand the fallacy that's been created here with some of these principles behind transparency in our elections. Thank you, Mr. President.
All right, anybody else? Senator Dockstader.
Thank you. I don't understand why we would stand against transparency. If there's 1.1 million or 2.8 million being designated as dark money, why would we allow that? In this country, why would we allow something that's so wrong? If it's dark money, there's no transparency. In this last legislative election, there were postcards sent out with information that was not truthful. It's my understanding it was the dark money backing that. Why would we support something like that? Why not support truth and transparency on and for this resolution?
Anybody else? Question being called. Senate Joint Resolution 8 having been read 3 separate times. The question is, shall the bill pass? The chief clerk will call the roll.
Third reading roll call, Senate Joint Resolution number 8. Anderson. Aye. Barlow. Aye. Boner. No. Brennan. Aye. Case. Aye. Cooper. Aye. Crago. Aye. Crum. Aye. Dockstader. Aye. Driscoll. Aye. French. No. Guru. Aye. Hicks. No. Hutchings. Ide. No. Jones. Aye. Cole. No. Landon. Aye. Larson. No. McEwen. No. Nethercott. Aye. Olson. Aye. Pappas excused. Pearson. No. Rothfuss. Aye. Salazar. No. Schuler. Aye. Scott. Aye. Smith. No. Steinmetz. No. President Beitman.
No.
No. Closing vote. Closing. Vote closed. Senate Joint Resolution 8, 17 ayes, 13 noes, 1 excused.
Having received the affirmative vote of the majority of the members elected to the Senate, Senate Joint Resolution 8 has passed the Senate. Madam Majority Floor Leader, that clears the desk.
Mr. President, I move that we stand recessed until 2 p.m.
All right, any announcements? Senator Case?
Mr. President, your committee number 7 is considering going back to work on these things that came over from the other side that are called bills. I don't know if I'm that geared up for that, but I think we're gonna try to start tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, and I know there's a important event, and we may not get started right at 8, but our goal is to start up at 8 and hear House Bill 47 engrossed, Secretary of State expedited filings, House Bill 69, foreign adversary ownership or control of business entities. That's in the connector room 4, corporations.
Thank you, Senator Case. Senator Olson.
Thank you, Mr. President. Judiciary will meet at 12:45 in room 2 to consider House Bill 54, Transfer Court Judges, District Circuit Court Assistants, and House Bill 189, Harmful Communications Minors.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Schuler.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senate Education Committee will meet tomorrow morning, Wednesday, February 12th, 8 o'clock in room W10, 110, excuse me, and online, and we will take a look at HB 199, the Wyoming Freedom Scholarship Act. That's the only bill that we'll take a look at.
Thank you, Senator Schuler. Anybody else? Senator McEwen.
Thank you, Mr. President. Your committee number 3, Revenue, will meet tomorrow upon noon recess to hear House Bill 11 engrossed, Manufacturing Sales and Use Tax Exemptions Amendments, and House Bill 75, Coal Severance Tax Rate. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Anybody else? Over to you, Senator Bartlett.
Thank you, Mr. President. Your committee number 10, Labor, Health, Social Service, meet tomorrow, Wednesday, February 12th, noon recess, to hear House Bill 82, Provider Enrollment and Standards. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Any other announcements? You've all heard the motion. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. Senate will stand in recess till 2 p.m.